You think a pandemic lockdown is bad? You're not a lab monkey locked up at the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center, where monkeys go crazy from caged isolation, ripping out their hair, their distressed lives leaving them with chronic diarrhea. There are 2,400 monkeys abused by experimenters at the University of Wisconsin lab in Madison. A PETA Undercover investigation has new shocking video. What you can do to end this primate research, next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, a PETA undercover investigation, this time at the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where monkeys go crazy from being under lockdown as they wait to be used in animal experiments. It begins with breeding. Males are put in restraint chairs, then electroshocked to induce ejaculation. Their sperm is then used to artificially inseminate a female. When the female gives birth, the baby is taken away, and then the real cruel experiments begin on maternal deprivation. Just one experiment among a list of horrors. Labs get away with it all because, even when caught, the fines are so minimal. It's seen by the labs as the cost of doing business. That's why PETA's undercover videos are important, to let the public know how millions in taxpayer dollars continue to fund these kind of hideous animal experiments in the U.S. Here's my conversation with Dr. Alka Chanda, Vice President of PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department, with more of what the University of Wisconsin doesn't want you to know on the PETA Podcast. We have these undercover investigations, and it seems PETA is doing a lot of them these days, but they're necessary because I don't think people understand. If we don't have these undercover investigations, would we have the knowledge of what's going on at these primate research centers?
We'd have less knowledge than we do. And yes, undercover investigations are really the heart and soul of PETA. It is how we pull back the curtain on how animals are used and abused in the various places, industries, and so on, where they're being exploited, whether that's, as in this case, a laboratory, or in other cases, factory farms, slaughterhouses, places where animals are used for the skin on their backs, for the clothing industry. In any of these places, it's really critical that we have to the moment information on how animals are being exploited so that the public can see what's going on and then make decisions based on that.
Yeah, because without these undercover investigations, anything we learn is so far after the fact, right? I mean, there must be a kind of lag between, but by the time we get information and the time something heinous or something despicable has happened to animals in the research facilities, right?
That's absolutely true, Emil. And one of the things that I think about in that regard with the time lapse is the issue of PETA submitting open records requests or public records requests using sunshine laws of various states, or even the Freedom of Information Act, to try to get video footage from different laboratories. That's something that my department and our legal team have been working on. And we can submit a request right now, today, for a set of video files that were recorded yesterday. But it could be 3, 4, 5 years before we ever see
that long. That long, really? 3, 4, 5 years?
Well, what we've been seeing is that the laboratories are loath to hand over the video footage, and so they will use every trick in the book to try to keep it from us, whether it's overcharging, saying that the information in these videotapes is going to be proprietary, or they just outright deny us what we've requested. In one case, we even saw that an experimenter destroyed the tapes before we could get a hold of the footage.
So in many ways, having an undercover investigator and then being able to release this footage, it is a big deal, and it does help us understand what is going on right now at these primate research centers, which there are, 7 across the country, correct? And
that's exactly right, Emil. Yeah, 7.
So this undercover research investigation took place at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And they're one of the big ones in the country. They have, how many animals do they have at that research center?
They have thousands of animals. Probably if you include mice and rats and fishes, we're probably talking tens of thousands of animals. Our investigation was centered at the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center, which is, you could say, hosted by or affiliated with the University of Wisconsin Madison. In the eyes of the government, the two institutions are one and the same, covered under the same U.S. Department of Agriculture registration and covered under the same National Institutes of Health assurance. There, we're talking about 2,400 monkeys in that facility.
So 2,400 monkeys, the undercover investigator goes in, takes these videos. What were the conditions of the monkeys? What did he find?
Like a lot of places, the conditions are absolutely bleak. And you understand when you're watching this footage day after day, week after week, month after month, and this was a 6-month investigation. And every day you're seeing these very bleak conditions. And you understand that from the moment these monkeys are born to the moment that they're killed or they die, it's just a life of absolute privation. They are forced to live, if you can call it living, in sterile metal cages where they might be able to take a few steps in any direction. These cages, these boxes in which they're held as though they're inanimate objects, are themselves held in windowless rooms with cinder block walls. And this is the entirety of these animals' lives. Some of these animals have been at the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center for upward of 20 years. They've been there for decades. And day after day, they exist in these environments where not only is their physical locomotion constrained, but everything in their lives is absolutely artificial. They're fed the same food day after day. They can't control what happens in their lives. So whether or not they have a companion in the cage, whether they're compatible with the other monkey in the cage, if they are co-housed with another monkey, what happens to them is also foisted on them, whether they're going to be taken out of their cage and used in a painful procedure, used in an invasive surgery, after which they're thrown back into the cage.
Yeah, what I noticed is that even before we talk about the things that are done to the monkeys in terms of research and the experiments, that if you just think about what the condition of being in a cage and being in that kind of captivity is like, the monkeys, that alone is enough for monkeys to tear out their hair, for monkeys to go around. They self-mutilate. They start going bald because they're tearing out their hair, and they're going down to the bone in some instances. And in several cases, they have like decades worth of diarrhea just from being in captivity. This is before any kind of research, just being in this lockdown situation. It seems like it just seems so incredibly cruel to see these. I mean, this is before, just by being locked up, that this happens.
Yeah, this is one of the points that we think it's really important for people to understand. It is imprisonment. That is what's going on in laboratories, particularly, well, with all of the animals. All of the animals are sensitive. All of them are intelligent. All of them have a keen desire to be free. And in laboratories, all of the animals are held in these artificial conditions, denied everything that would make their life worth living. And most of all, most poignantly and most importantly, they're denied the ability to be autonomous, to make decisions about what happens in their lives. And that's like being institutionalized. I mean, that's what's going on with them. They are institutionalized. So nothing that happens to them is determined by them. Their autonomy is stripped away from them. They cannot make determinations about what happens in their lives.
What strikes me about the video, and the video is available at PETA.org, and people can see it, and you can see the narrative that was provided by the investigator. But it's really, you can't even call it cradle to grave kind of situation in an analogous situation, maybe, but it's like from even before birth, right? They take a monkey and they segregate the males from the females, and the males are forced to ejaculate by electroshock. That seems to be a little extreme. I mean, that's and there's pictures of that.
That's right. All of the National Primate Research Centers serve as breeding facilities on top of experimentation facilities. And so there's an active breeding program in place where, as you say, the males are used as semen donors, essentially. I'm putting air quotes around donors because they're not willfully offering up their semen. But as you say, they're placed in a restraint chair. Sometimes their arms are, placed behind their back. They're not really able to move. It's already terrifying for them. They've been taken out of the cage where they're, which is considered their quote unquote home cage. They're taken out, always handled roughly, put into a restraint chair where they're immobilized essentially. And yes, their penises are electroshocked so that they ejaculate. And then this semen is used. It might be sold to other facilities, but it's used to artificially inseminate female monkeys. Wisconsin National Primate Research Center also uses quote unquote natural means of breeding. So they will have males and females engaging in sex to try to get the females to become impregnated. And I say quote unquote natural because, there's just nothing natural about any of this. The females aren't choosing the males aren't choosing the females. They're essentially put together for, maybe half an hour and then taken apart. And
so it's worse than an arranged marriage, really. I mean, they're kind of put together, right? I mean, that's not really normal, but it gets worse when you consider that, okay, the once a female gets impregnated and she gives birth, then they separate the baby from the mother. And that's where really the experimentation begins, really, because that's sort of a basic experiment they do at the Wisconsin Primate Center, where they test to see what it's like for the baby to be apart from the mother and vice versa. And I guess we didn't we needed the experiment to know that was bad.
We most certainly did not. I think any rudimentary observation of mothers and their babies, whether that's human or other primates or even mice and rats, you observe the mothers with their infants, and it's totally clear that there's a very solid bond there that's critical for proper development. Yes, Wisconsin National Primate Research Center is where Harry Harlow, notorious animal experimenter, pioneered, again with the air quotes, he pioneered maternal deprivation experiments where he would remove baby monkeys from their mothers, put the babies with surrogates, wired contraptions, what he called monster mothers, these inanimate dolls, I suppose, with spikes that would protrude.
The babies from the very beginning are taken from their mothers, and they're never reunited ever, are they?
That's right. And, what I want to say about Harry Harlow is that people, who know about Harry Harlow tend to think of maternal deprivation experiments as being something from the past. And although Harry Harlow, is finished and done and buried, other people who basically came up in Harry Harlow's lab and learned their trade from him continue to do maternal deprivation experiments of various sorts and early life stress experiments and so on, including at Wisconsin National Primate Research Center. But I think the thing that's even more nefarious, more troubling, is that it's not just for, this, you could say, limited scope of psychology experiments, maternal deprivation experiments, for which infants are removed from their mother. In fact, at the National Primate Research Centers, writ large, many of the infants are removed from their mothers as a standard operating procedure because, once again, the monkeys are bred because experimenters want a steady supply of infants whom they can then use in experiments. And so the purpose of the breeding isn't for these monkeys to have a nice family life and to make the lives of the, mother monkeys who are condemned to this hellish existence to have, a fuller life. No, the purpose of the breeding is so that these babies can then be ripped from their mothers. And that's really what it is. That is what happens. The babies are ripped from their mothers and then used in experiments.
And this is something that Harry Harlow, who's now the late and not so lamented by animal rights activists, but he's gone, but the research lives on. And the question is, why? Is there a reason for this to exist after? I mean, is there any new knowledge or new research that? Well, there's new research, but is there anything valuable to humankind that comes out of this new research?
There's nothing valuable to humankind that comes out of this research. The only thing that I would say we learn from this is, the bleakness of the characters of some of the people who operate these laboratories. Now, they will say that you look at somebody like Harry Harlow and you look at the experiments that he did, and you might do some behavioral tests to see what the impact is on infant monkeys when they are raised without their mothers. And so Harry Harlow did all these experiments. You raise the infants without their mothers, and then they become psychologically and even physiologically compromised. They have a difficult time maintaining friendships. They have a difficult time having a partner. All of these things. They themselves are not good mothers. After having been deprived of a mother themselves. So there are all these behavioral things that came out of Harlow's experiments, which again, I will reiterate, we would have known if we just paid attention to what happens with human beings, and the mother-child bond. But what the experimenters these days will do is they will look at things like the HPA axis, or, these various hormones and biological mechanistic pathways to say, oh, this is what's going on. Now, that's all very interesting and good. But the issue is that, if you want to understand what's going on in humans, doing this sort of thing in monkeys will not give you the data you're looking for, because you simply can't translate the mechanisms in monkeys to what happens in human beings.
So once again, we have a situation where experiments on non-human species, no value to human species, yet the money is there because it's research and it's always been done this way. It's traditional research. And so it keeps the money flowing. And as long as the money is flowing, they keep hypothesizing with these research models that really don't yield much in terms of something to humans.
This is the question that we get asked all the time. If these experiments are not worthwhile, as you say, why do they continue? And so you really need to break it down. You think about somebody like Harlow, he had dozens of graduate students. Now, these people went on, to various universities around the country and globally, and they established their own laboratories, their own primate laboratories, where they had monkeys. Now, in order to have a monkey laboratory, you need grants. Who's deciding who gets grants? Well, these are study sections at the National Institutes of Health. And who sits on those study sections? Well, the people who do animal experimentation. They dominate those study sections. And because this is the paradigm that's come through in biomedical sciences, that's what rules the day. And so you have a system that is not only unethical, which to my mind, to my thinking, is enough to say, the end, stop it. It's not ethical. You can't do this. You're taking vulnerable animals who are intelligent and social and have a right to live their lives independent from how we might exploit them. And they are not consenting to be used in these experiments. So that alone should be enough to say no. But what you've got is this paradigm where you do these unethical experiments and everything else that follows, the money, the approval, everything, is part of this massive paradigm that's really entrenched. And so our challenge, and I think we're up to it, is to knock that down.
Right, because you're really dealing with the legacy of Harlow, Harry Harlow, which has been perpetuated by his acolytes, and now they have risen in their field because of these outdated standards. And meanwhile, I know there are scientists who know there are non-animal models, that there is new science, there's better ways to get at the data that we need to confirm or affirm studies that or things that would apply to humans. And yet they're still in the infancy of their development compared to they're sort of meeting up with the age-old paradigm. It seems like unless we have more of these exposés through undercover investigators, the public doesn't really know where we stand in terms of creating this new paradigm or undoing the old one or getting rid of the old one. I mean, we really need more of these undercover investigations.
We do, and we need more public education. But, I take heart in looking at, for example, the Pew Research poll or Gallup polls that have through the years looked at the question of where do Americans stand on the morality of using animals in experimentation. And what we've seen is that there's been a massive shift where now we have, where previously it was just a tiny minority of people who oppose the use of animals in experimentation. Now we see that a majority of Americans oppose the use of animals in experimentation. And, those margins go up when you're talking about animals with whom we're familiar, like dogs and cats, right. And then animals who are more like us, like monkeys.
Well, these are macaques, right? Macaque monkeys. And,
right.
And so just to get back to what the undercover investigator found, there's monkeys like Coco the macaque who had, he was taken away from his mother. There's Noah. What got me is that 22 years just living under these circumstances, 22 years, that's like a college graduate, I guess, And
I think that in order to really understand what these animals' lives are all about, what you just did is exactly what's needed. We think about, like you said, Noah, there's another monkey, Livingston. And some of these monkeys were named by the experimenters. Some of them were named by our investigator. Many of them just had sort of an alphanumeric designation. And, that was the extent of their identity as far as the laboratory was concerned. But to appreciate, that day in, day out, just the monotony of their lives, the the unending misery, the unending anxiety, the stress that they face, and just sort of mapping it onto your own life. I know that Ingrid Newkirk, PETA founder and president, has talked about being aware of a monkey in a laboratory and thinking about her own life against that monkey, who had been in the laboratory for 20 years in this basement facility, cinder block walls, in a metal cage where he could take a couple of steps in any direction. And she thought that she herself, had done these various things, had traveled to various places, had eaten different foods, had the companionship of friends and others. And, just to think about how in one life we're doing all of these different things. And in another life, we're talking about just this extreme impoverishment, just this monotony and this horrific lack of control. I know I keep saying that, I keep coming back to that, but that really is, the thing that defines what these animals' lives are all about. And that is manifest physiologically. So many, many, many of the monkeys at Wisconsin National Primate Research Center are afflicted with diarrhea. They have persistent diarrhea, they have recurrent diarrhea, they have chronic diarrhea. We're talking, some monkeys have had diarrhea for 20 years. Yeah. For decades, they have diarrhea. And all manner of treatments are given to these animals, and the facility will say, oh, look, we are giving treatments. We care about these animals. But they're not looking at the root cause of the diarrhea, which is stress. This stress, which is so great that it becomes trauma. And the trauma is such that it impacts the physiology of these animals. So you have these animals who have chronic diarrhea for these long periods of time. When you have chronic diarrhea, you might become underweight. Many of the monkeys at Wisconsin National Primate Research Center were underweight. They were not thriving. They have a poor body condition. Some of them suffered with rectal prolapse, which is connected to diarrhea and connected to stress. So there's this constellation of physiological factors. You brought up earlier, Emil, the issue of hair loss. And this is, the primatologists tell us that monkeys will pull out their own hair in laboratories. This is not something we see in nature. We don't see this in forests or on the savanna. This is something that happens in laboratories because the monkeys feel that they don't have any control over anything else. This is the prevailing thinking of why this happens. And so they will pull out their own hair because that's something they can control. And so we see monkeys like a monkey whom our investigator named Princess. For many years, she was used to breed monkeys. And every single one of her babies was taken away from her. So she's in a condition of terrible distress, to the point where you see her, and I invite people to go to our website, check out the video, and you see that she's basically bald. And to me, the image of Princess, and there's video footage of her, is so haunting because she's in a state of utter terror. Her eyes are piercing out, and it's like she's saying, what is happening to me? And why is this not stopping? And she's holding, when we were in the laboratory, when our investigator was there, Princess had given birth and she had her baby. And you see her holding on to the baby, and you just know that she knows that that baby is going to be taken away from her. And there's nothing she can do to stop it. And this is, and everything that she's experienced in that godforsaken laboratory is evident in her body, underweight, without hair, She suffered from diarrhea as well, like so many of the monkeys.
And the only real expression of her rage is in this self-mutilation, which is really incredibly sad. And to think that this is their life. I mean, can they breed? How often or how long are they able to breed? At some point, she is no longer useful to the researchers. And then what happens to her?
There's a very instrumental view of these animals. To the experimenters, these animals are just instruments. They're tools to their ends. So, right now, Princess is being used to breed new monkeys for the facility. And they'll make a determination when she's no longer able to breed, if she's no longer able to get impregnated. Maybe they'll kill her at that point. Maybe they'll say, oh, well, she could be used in this other experiment. And then her suffering continues even further. So it all depends on what the Primate Center determines, and that'll be her fate.
And yet, in the meantime, all this stuff happens to her and to the other 2,400 monkeys, these macaques. And I know there's an Animal Welfare Act that should protect them. And sometimes it does. But as I understand it, the fines are like, $74,000, which is compared to a program that might bring in millions of dollars to a university or to a primate center. $74,000, it sounds like cost of doing business. Is that the way they look at it?
2019, last year, the University of Wisconsin Madison received $300 million, more than $300 million.
$300 million?
From the National Institutes of Health. And it's estimated that about half of that goes to animal experimentation, so $150 million. And you contrast that with the most recent fine that was levied against the university for violations of the Animal Welfare Act. And, these are violations have to do with failure to ensure that monkeys who were held together in a cage were compatible, resulting in fights. The fights resulted in severe injuries where monkeys, had to have fingers amputated or a tail amputated, things of that nature. Horrific violations where the facility failed to provide veterinary care for animals. Really extreme, violations that indicate egregious suffering of the monkeys. And yes, $74,000.
And so this is something that if you're getting 300 million, well, 74,000, you can absorb that. The monkeys can't absorb the pain, but certainly the facility can absorb a little fine, which leads us to the question, how do we change this? What kind of force of law? Is it force of law? Is it force of the voice of the people? What can get people at that facility to stop the unethical practices that mete out torture to these monkeys and to these animals?
I take some sense of optimism from what we've seen historically. Not that long ago, in 2015, Harvard University, which hosted the New England National Primate Research Center, was seeing a lot of violations as well. There we were seeing that monkeys died of thirst because the Primate Center couldn't be bothered to ensure that the water going into the cages was actually being delivered. And so multiple monkeys died that way. Again, there were injuries, lack of veterinary care, the whole 9 yards, which we see, frankly, across the board at these places. But Harvard University decided that they didn't want this, basically a public relations nightmare on their hands. There were a lot of articles that were published about the media articles in the newspaper about the failures at the New England National Primate Research Center. People were concerned about taxpayer dollars going to fund this abuse. And so Harvard said enough, and they pulled the plug. And they closed down their center, which is excellent. And that's what we'd like to see here in Wisconsin, for the University of Wisconsin Madison to say, it's not worth a headache to us. We're going to pull the plug.
When Harvard did this, that was really considered it hadn't been heard of before. I mean, that was a major victory. And I guess in an idealistic sense, one would say, well, I guess now the others will follow suit and they'll just, fold just like Harvard did. But that hasn't been the case.
Well, and that was only 5 years ago. And I think Harvard, what that decision represented to me is that the writing's on the wall. What we saw at the New England National Primate Research Center is the same as what we're seeing elsewhere. It's not like the New England National Primate Research Center was particularly problematic. All of these places are problematic. It's just a matter, and what I would also point out is that, the decision was made in 2013. The center closed down in 2015. And this is the era when, because of all the undercover investigation that PETA has been doing for the past 40 years, because of increased understanding of who macaques and other primates and other monkeys and other animals, frankly, are, because of all of this information that we have about the sentience of animals, the fact that they're not automatons, that they are living, breathing individuals who deserve to be free. You sort of put all of these things together, and then you also have all this information about the futility of doing animal experiments. If what you want are advances in human medicine, then, if that's what you want, if you want advances in human medicine, stop investing in an archaic, outdated, proven to have failed enterprise, which is animal experimentation. So I think you have all of these factors coming together and coming to the fore, and that pushed Harvard's hand. And those factors continue today. And I think it's just a matter of getting, to the boiling point, and we push it over the edge. I think it's going to happen.
And it takes people like people listening to this podcast. It takes people who are members of PETA, people who are just ordinary citizens who might go to PETA.org and look at those videos of the primates at the Wisconsin Primate Center under the auspices of the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And as you point out, it's not just Harvard which shut down on its own, but these things are happening at Wisconsin. They're happening at the Oregon Primate Center. They're happening in Washington State. They're happening, 7 other facilities. So now is the time, if you have not heard or seen about these experiments, to go to PETA.org. And Alka, what can people do to add their voices? There's some kind of form they can fill out there.
Yeah, there's a petition. You can sign your name, and that sends an email to the National Institutes of Health asking that the agency pull funds from the University of Wisconsin Madison. In light of the fact that there are such egregious abuses of animals at the facility, so people can do that. We also ask that people share this information, with everyone whether it's your colleagues, your family members, your friends. Post it on your social media. What really amazes me is that in spite of all of this effort that we put into these investigations, frankly, people are busy. They have their lives. They're, thinking through all manner of issues that they might have, raising a family, making ends meet, putting food on the table. But because of, all these different things that compete for people's attention, what we often see is that people aren't even aware that there are still animals in laboratories. And so there's a barrier here that we need to break through. Yeah. We know that when people learn about the fact that animals are imprisoned in laboratories, that they are treated so abysmally, that they live such horrific lives of utter suffering, we know that when people recognize that they want to take action, they want to see this stop, and then they can speak to people and agencies, or they can speak to their member of Congress, ask that our tax dollars stop being wasted on this absolutely archaic and pointless endeavor.
Because I think a lot of people, you brought up a couple of things. One is that a lot of people think that all this has ended. You know, wasn't there a case in the 80s, the Silver Spring monkeys? Didn't that end all this? But we still have it going on today, and people have to take action. And the other question that comes up is that people might say, oh, come on. Does an email really do anything? Does a call to a senator, or does a call to the president at the University of Wisconsin Madison, does any of those kind of things, which seem so simple? I can do an email now. I can pick up a phone now and call. Does it really have any kind of impact on getting these terrible experiments to end?
It absolutely has an impact. I mean, these are the sorts of strategies. These are the sorts of actions. This was our theory of change around everything that happened with the New England National Primate Research Center. It's about letting the institutions know that there's a price that you pay for hosting this level of abuse, that the public does not stand for this, will not stand for this, and wants to see it end. So having our voices heard is really critical. And, you can also think about it this way. We know that Princess is imprisoned at the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center. We know that there's a monkey named Cornelius who has been used in all manner of horrible psychology experiments, early life stress experiments, things like that. And if people go and look at the video taken by our investigator, they'll see Cornelius is folded in over himself. That's the pose that he assumes and has assumed for so many months when our investigator was visiting him in the cage where he was held. He's absolutely depressed. It's like the outer world doesn't even exist for him. There's Cornelius. There are the other monkeys who you mentioned, Coco, the infant, who is with, her mother. And there was a cage mate who was so stressed that they attacked the infant. They attacked Coco. These animals are so vulnerable. And if they could speak out, they would. If they were powerful enough to stop the animal experimenters, they would. We've seen them trying. We see them rattling the cages. We see them protesting when an experimenter is handling another animal roughly. We've seen this. They stick out their small arms and they yank at the lab coat of a violent experimenter. They do what they can. And I feel that it's incumbent on us to do what we can.
Dr. Alka Chandna, Vice President of PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department, on the PETA Undercover investigation that exposes the hideous truth of animal experimentation in the U.S. Go to PETA.org, see the undercover video of the monkeys at the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Then take action. Right there on the website, send a message to the lab that animal abuse in labs is unacceptable in the 21st century. See the video, take action at PETA.org. And that's our show this time out. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on AMOK.com, or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts or wherever you like to get your podcasts. And don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.